Welcome, curious minds, to Beyond Midnight, where we delve into the shadows of history and unearth the forgotten truths of the past. If you haven't already, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and join our ever-growing community of explorers. Tonight, we journey back over 1,000 years to a world forged in ice and iron, a world where survival was a daily battle and comfort was a forgotten luxury. We're stepping into the heart of Viking life, into the very structure that defined their existence, the Longhouse. Prepare yourselves, for we are about to experience life in a Viking Longhouse, brutal and cold. Imagine a world without central heating, without insulated walls, without even a window pane to keep out the biting wind. A world where the sun, for much of the year, was a fleeting whisper, and darkness reigned supreme. This was the reality for the Norse people, the Vikings, who carved their lives out of the unforgiving landscapes of Scandinavia, Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Their homes, these iconic longhouses, were not just shelters. They were fortresses against the elements, communal hubs of survival, and the very crucible in which their fierce culture was forged. But make no mistake, life within their sturdy walls was far from idyllic. It was a relentless struggle against the cold, against hunger, against disease, a daily testament to human resilience in the face of nature's most brutal whims. The first impression of a Viking longhouse for a modern eye might be one of rustic simplicity, perhaps even primitive. But to the Norse, it was a marvel of engineering, a testament to their ingenuity and their profound understanding of their environment. These weren't flimsy shacks, they were substantial structures, often stretching 50, 70, even 100 feet or more in length, and perhaps 20 feet wide. Their design was dictated by the materials at hand and the climate they had to endure. In timber-rich regions like Norway, they were predominantly built from massive logs, expertly notched and fitted. Further west, in Iceland or Greenland, where trees were scarce, the walls were thick, insulating layers of turf stacked like bricks, often over a stone or timber frame, providing an unparalleled barrier against the wind and cold. The roofs, universally, were pitched affairs, covered with turf or thatch, sometimes weighted down with stones, to shed the snow and rain, further enhancing their insulation. From the outside, a longhouse often blended seamlessly into the landscape, a low, humped back rising from the earth, almost like a natural feature, exhaling a faint plume of smoke into the perpetually gray sky. But the true story, the raw, visceral experience, began the moment you stepped through the low, often single door. There was no grand entrance, no vestibule to ease the transition from the freezing outdoors to the slightly less freezing indoors. You simply entered, and immediately your senses would be assaulted. The first thing that would hit you, perhaps even before the chill, was the smell. A potent, complex aroma, an olfactory tapestry woven from centuries of communal living. It was the smell of wood smoke, thick and resinous, clinging to every surface, permeating every garment. It was the smell of unwashed bodies, of damp wool and leather. It was the earthy scent of the turf walls, perpetually moist, mingling with the pungent tang of animal droppings from the livestock that often shared the very same space. It was the faint, sweet-sour scent of fermenting food, of dried fish, of simmering stews, all layered upon each other, creating an unforgettable, inescapable signature of home. The darkness, too, would be profound. Even in the middle of the day, the longhouse interior was a realm of perpetual twilight. Light entered sparingly, primarily through the smoke hole in the roof, a necessary evil that allowed some of the smoke to escape, but also invited in the elements. There might be small, unglazed openings, mere slits in the walls, but these were few and far between, designed more for defense and minimal ventilation than for illumination. The primary source of light, and indeed heat, was the central hearth, a long stone-lined trench that ran down the spine of the longhouse. Here, fires were kept burning almost constantly, a flickering, dancing heart around which all life revolved. The glow would cast long, shifting shadows, making familiar objects appear monstrous, and faces gleam with an almost otherworldly intensity. It was a world of chiaroscuro, where the edges of reality were softened, blurred by smoke and shadow. And then, of course, there was the cold. Oh, the cold. Even with a roaring fire in the central hearth, the longhouse was never truly warm, not in the way we understand warmth today. The heat radiated outwards, but the extremities of the longhouse, the sleeping platforms along the walls, the storage areas, remained perpetually frigid. The earth floor, often covered with rushes or straw, would transmit the ground's chill directly upwards. Drafts would seep in through every crack and crevice in the walls, around the door, through the smoke hole. The very air you breathed would often be icy, and the moisture from breath and cooking would condense on the cold surfaces, leaving a permanent dampness that chilled to the bone. To truly appreciate the Viking experience, one must understand that they lived in a state of constant, low-level hypothermia, a persistent battle against the cold that shaped every decision, every action, every waking moment. Imagine waking up on a long, dark winter morning. You're nestled on a sleeping platform, likely shared with several family members, perhaps even a whole family unit. Your bed is a pile of straw or animal furs, offering a meager buffer against the biting cold seeping up from the earth. The air is heavy with the scent of old smoke and the exhaled breath of many bodies. You can hear the rustling of the animals at the far end of the house. The sheep, the goats, perhaps a cow or two, their body heat a small, vital contribution to the overall warmth, their presence a constant reminder of the intertwined nature of human and animal life. The first task of the day, almost before anything else, would be to tend the fire. Embers from the previous night would be carefully nursed back to life, perhaps with a puff of breath and the addition of dry kindling. This was a skill, a vital one, for a fire was not just for warmth. It was for cooking, for light, for protection, for life itself. As the fire slowly took hold, its flickering light would begin to push back the encroaching darkness. The longhouse would slowly, grudgingly, begin to stir. Children, bundled in wool, would emerge from their sleeping furs, their breath pluming in the frigid air. The men would begin to ready their tools for the day's tasks, whether it was mending fishing nets, sharpening axes, or tending to the livestock. The women would start the arduous process of preparing the first meal, and what a meal it would be. Food in a Viking longhouse was a matter of survival, not culinary delight. It was hearty, often bland, and designed to provide maximum calories and warmth in a world where energy was constantly being expended to simply stay alive. The diet was heavily reliant on what could be hunted, fished, gathered, or grown in the short, intense growing seasons. Meat, when available, was a prized commodity. Wild game, deer, elk, wild boar was hunted, but domestic animals like sheep, goats, pigs, and cattle also provided sustenance. Fish, especially cod and herring, was a staple, particularly in coastal areas, and could be dried, smoked, or salted to preserve it for the long winter months. Grains like barley and oats were cultivated, ground into flour, and used to make bread or porridge. Root vegetables such as turnips and carrots, and wild greens and berries supplemented the diet when in season. Cooking was a communal affair, centered around the hearth. Large iron cauldrons would hang over the flames, bubbling with stews and porridges. These stews, often a mix of whatever meat, fish, or vegetables were available, simmered for hours, sometimes days, constantly being replenished. It was an efficient way to cook for many people, and the long cooking times helped tenderize tough cuts of meat and make grains more digestible. Bread was often baked on hot stones near the fire, or in simple ovens if the longhouse was equipped with one. The constant presence of food cooking, the steam rising, the aroma, would have been a comforting counterpoint to the ever-present chill and the dampness. But even with a full stomach, the cold would quickly begin to seep back in, a constant reminder of the environment's power. The daily chores in a longhouse were relentless and unforgiving, dictated by the seasons and the constant need for survival. For the men, the day might involve tending to the fields if it was planting or harvest season, a back-breaking task performed with simple tools like wooden plows and hoes. In winter, or when farming was not possible, they might be engaged in hunting, a dangerous but essential pursuit, requiring skill, patience, and courage. Fishing was another critical activity, often involving long hours out on the frigid waters, battling the elements to bring in the day's catch. Craftsmanship was also vital. Woodworking to repair tools, build boats, or construct new parts of the longhouse. Metalworking for weapons and tools. Leatherworking for shoes and clothing. Trade, too, was a male domain, involving long, perilous journeys across land and sea, bringing back valuable goods, but also exposing them to the dangers of the wider world. And of course, there was the famed raiding, an activity that brought wealth and renown, but also great risk and loss. All these activities, whether peaceful or violent, were undertaken with the constant knowledge that the fruits of their labor were directly tied to the survival of everyone within the longhouse. For the women, life within the longhouse was equally demanding, perhaps even more so, as their responsibilities were often continuous, day in and day out, regardless of the season. They were the undisputed mistresses of the household, managing the complex logistics of feeding, clothing, and caring for a large, extended family. Food preparation was a monumental task, involving not just cooking, but also the arduous processes of preservation: salting fish and meat, drying herbs, smoking provisions, fermenting drinks. Textiles were another major responsibility, from shearing wool from the sheep to cleaning, carding, spinning it into thread, and then weaving it into cloth on massive upright looms. This was a labor-intensive process that provided all the clothing, blankets, and sails for the community. The constant hum of the loom, the rhythmic clack of the shuttle, would have been a familiar soundtrack to longhouse life. Child-rearing, of course, was paramount, ensuring the next generation survived the harsh conditions and learned the necessary skills. Women were also often involved in farming, especially during planting and harvest, and in tending to the smaller livestock. Their work was the very bedrock upon which the longhouse community stood, ensuring its continuity and well-being. Even the children from a young age were expected to contribute. There was no concept of a prolonged childhood free from responsibility. As soon as they were able, they would be given tasks appropriate to their age and strength: gathering firewood, tending to the fire, fetching water, helping with food preparation, looking after younger siblings, assisting with spinning or simple crafts. Play was undoubtedly a part of their lives, but it was often interwoven with practical learning, preparing them for the harsh realities of adulthood. They learned by observation, by imitation, by doing, absorbing the skills and knowledge passed down through generations, essential for their survival in this unforgiving world. The interior layout of a longhouse, while seemingly simple, was a marvel of functional design, reflecting the communal and hierarchical nature of Viking society. The central hearth, as mentioned, was the hearth, providing heat, light, and a focal point for social interaction. Running parallel to the hearth along both sides of the longhouse were raised platforms. These served multiple purposes. During the day, they were workbenches, seating areas, and places for social gathering. At night, they became sleeping platforms where families huddled together for warmth. The most prominent family, the head of the household, would likely occupy the platforms closest to the center of the longhouse, perhaps even having a slightly more enclosed space, a small room or partition, signaling their status. Further along the platforms, other family members, dependents, or even thralls, slaves, would find their space. Privacy, as we understand it, was a foreign concept. Life was lived in public, in close proximity, a constant negotiation of personal space within the communal whole. At the far ends of the longhouse, separated from the main living area, often by a low partition or simply by distance, were the animal pens. Here, during the harsh winter months, the precious livestock, cows, sheep, goats, were brought inside to protect them from the elements and from predators. Their presence was not just practical, it was essential. Their body heat, though modest, contributed significantly to the overall warmth of the longhouse, a natural living heating system. But their presence also added to the longhouse's unique sensory profile: the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the rustling of straw, and of course, the ever-present smell of their waste. Mucking out the animal pens would have been a regular, unpleasant chore, but a necessary one to maintain some semblance of hygiene and prevent disease. Storage was another critical aspect of longhouse life. Every available nook and cranny would be utilized. Food supplies, dried fish, smoked meats, sacks of grain, barrels of ale or mead would be stored in designated areas, often in cooler, darker corners or in pits dug into the earth floor. Tools, weapons, weaving equipment, fishing gear, and other essential items would be hung from the rafters or stored in chests. There was no superfluous clutter. Every item had a purpose. Every space was maximized for efficiency. The entire longhouse was a carefully organized machine for survival, a testament to the meticulous planning required to sustain life through long, dark winters. The smoke, though partially vented through the smoke hole, was an ever-present companion. It would hang in the air, stinging the eyes, coating the lungs, and leaving a permanent patina on every surface. The Vikings, through generations, would have developed a certain tolerance, but the health implications were undeniable. Respiratory illnesses would have been common, and the constant irritation to the eyes would have contributed to various ailments. Yet, the smoke also played a vital role beyond just warmth. It helped to preserve food, deter insects, and act as a natural disinfectant, a small, unintended benefit in a world without modern medicine. Clothing was another crucial defense against the brutal cold. It was not about fashion, but about survival. Layers were key. Undergarments of linen or wool, followed by tunics, trousers, and dresses made from thicker wool. Outer garments included cloaks, often made from heavy, felted wool or animal furs, providing essential insulation. Leather shoes or boots, often lined with wool or straw, protected the feet. Hats and hoods were vital to prevent heat loss from the head. Everything was handmade, often by the women of the household, a laborious process that ensured every stitch was functional and durable. The constant dampness, however, meant that clothes were often difficult to keep dry, adding to the chill and discomfort. Drying clothes near the hearth would have been a common sight, the steam rising as the garments slowly gave up their moisture, only to be donned again in the cold, damp air. Hygiene by modern standards was rudimentary at best and often non-existent. Water was a precious commodity, especially in winter when it had to be fetched from frozen rivers or melted from snow. Full body washing was rare, perhaps only a few times a year. More common was a quick rinse of hands and face. The lack of sanitation, combined with the close proximity of people and animals, created a fertile ground for disease. Lice and fleas were ubiquitous companions, an unavoidable part of life. Infections from cuts and wounds were common and often deadly, as there was no understanding of germ theory. Herbal remedies and folk medicine were the only recourse, often ineffective against serious ailments. Child mortality rates were astronomically high, and life expectancy was significantly shorter than today. Every cough, every fever, every ache was a potential harbinger of death, a stark reminder of the fragility of life in the longhouse. Yet despite the constant hardships, the Vikings were a people of immense skill and ingenuity. Within the longhouse, the crafts of survival flourished. Woodworking was paramount. Axes, knives, and adzes were used to shape timber for everything from structural repairs to intricately carved household items. Metalworking, though often performed by specialist smiths, was essential for tools, weapons, and jewelry, with the forge a rare but potent source of intense heat and light. Weaving, as mentioned, was a constant activity, producing the very fabric of their lives. Pottery, though less common than wooden or metal vessels, provided storage and cooking implements. Even boat building, though often done outside, was a craft that directly supported the longhouse's inhabitants, providing the means for fishing, trade, and exploration. These skills were not merely hobbies, they were fundamental to their existence, passed down from generation to generation, ensuring the community's self-sufficiency. Winter was the true test of the longhouse's endurance, and by extension, the endurance of its inhabitants. The long, dark months, with their perpetual twilight and biting winds, could stretch on for what felt like an eternity. Food scarcity became a pressing concern. The carefully preserved stores had to be rationed, every portion measured, every scrap utilized. The livestock brought inside consumed precious fodder, a constant calculation of how much could be spared versus how much was needed for their survival. The lack of fresh food would lead to nutritional deficiencies, weakening bodies already stressed by the cold and damp. The short, meager days offered little opportunity for outdoor work, forcing people indoors, intensifying the close quarters and the challenges of communal living. Boredom, too, would have been a significant challenge. With limited daylight and even more limited external activities, the Longhouse became the entire world for months on end. This is where the rich oral tradition of the Vikings truly came into its own. Storytelling was not just entertainment, it was education, history, and a vital means of passing down cultural knowledge. Sagas of heroes, gods, and epic journeys would be recounted by the firelight, captivating audiences, transporting them beyond the confines of the smoky Longhouse. Skaldic poetry, riddles, and games would help to pass the time, strengthening communal bonds and keeping spirits from succumbing to the oppressive darkness and monotony. The sagas, often performed by skilled storytellers, were more than just tales. They were living histories, connecting the present generation to their ancestors, reminding them of their heritage and their place in the cosmic order. But with the arrival of spring, a palpable shift would occur. The days would slowly lengthen, the sun would gain a little more strength, and the ice would begin to recede. This was a time of immense relief and renewed activity. The livestock, often emaciated but alive, would be led back out to pasture. The fields would be prepared for planting, a burst of energy and hope after the long dormancy of winter. Fishing expeditions would become more fruitful, and the first fresh greens and berries would be eagerly gathered. Summer was a period of intense activity, a race against time to prepare for the inevitable return of winter. Hay had to be cut and dried for animal fodder, crops had to be planted, tended, and harvested. Meat and fish had to be caught and preserved in vast quantities. This was also the season for trade and raiding, when the longships, built and maintained with the collective effort of the community, would set sail, bringing back wealth, goods, and sometimes new people. The Longhouse, though still the center, would become a quieter place during the day, as most inhabitants worked outside, bathed in the rare warmth of the sun. The spiritual life of the Vikings was deeply intertwined with their daily existence in the Longhouse. Before the widespread adoption of Christianity, the Norse followed a rich pagan tradition, worshipping a pantheon of gods and goddesses like Odin, Thor, and Freyja. These deities were not distant, abstract figures. They were intimately involved in the natural world and the lives of humans. Offerings, often of food or drink, might be made in specific areas of the Longhouse, perhaps near the hearth or a carved wooden post, to appease the gods, ensure good harvests, or bring success in raiding. Rituals, both formal and informal, would have punctuated the rhythm of life, from blessings before a hunt to celebrations after a successful harvest. The sagas themselves, recounted by the fire, often contained tales of the gods, reinforcing their presence and power. The Longhouse, therefore, was not just a physical space. It was also a sacred one, a place where the human and divine worlds intersected, where prayers and offerings were made, and where the spiritual well-being of the community was nurtured. Communal living, while essential for survival, also presented its own set of challenges, particularly when it came to conflict. With so many people living in such close proximity, disputes were inevitable, perhaps over a shared resource, a perceived slight, or a matter of honor. The Longhouse, therefore, also served as a kind of informal court, where grievances could be aired and ideally resolved. The head of the household, often the eldest male or a respected leader, would act as an arbitrator, using wisdom and experience to mediate disputes. If a resolution couldn't be found, more formal legal structures existed, often involving a local thing, assembly, where free men would gather to make laws and settle disputes. But within the Longhouse, the pressure to maintain harmony was immense, as prolonged conflict could threaten the very fabric of the community and, in turn, its ability to survive. Feasting and celebrations, however, provided vital opportunities for communal bonding. When a successful hunt or harvest occurred, or a significant event like a wedding or the naming of a child, the longhouse would transform into a vibrant hub of revelry. Mead and ale would flow, food would be abundant, and stories, songs, and laughter would fill the smoky air, momentarily pushing back the ever-present cold and hardship, reminding everyone of the joys of shared existence. The longhouse also functioned as a fortress, a place of defense against both human and animal threats. Its thick walls, whether of timber or turf, provided substantial protection. The low, single door, often reinforced, could be barred from the inside. Small, high windows or slits, if present, were designed to be difficult to penetrate, offering little opportunity for an attacker to gain entry. In times of conflict, the longhouse would become a stronghold, with its inhabitants preparing to defend their home, their family, and their accumulated wealth. Weapons, axes, spears, swords would be kept close at hand, a constant reminder of the violent realities of their world. The very design of the longhouse, therefore, was a reflection of a society that understood the necessity of self-defense, a people who lived in a world where security was never guaranteed. Beyond its function as a dwelling and a fortress, the longhouse was the quintessential social hub of Viking society. It was the gathering place for all important events. Here, alliances were forged, marriages were arranged, and major decisions affecting the community were debated and made. It was where guests, whether traders or traveling skalds, were welcomed and offered hospitality, a sacred duty in Viking culture. The sharing of food and drink around the central hearth was a powerful symbol of communal solidarity and mutual obligation. Young men would listen to the tales of their elders, learning the history and values of their people, internalizing the sagas that shaped their worldview. Young women would learn the intricate skills of household management and textile production from their mothers and grandmothers. It was a living, breathing classroom, a parliament, a feasting hall, and a sanctuary, all rolled into. The very architecture of the longhouse, with its open, communal space, fostered this constant interaction, shaping a society that valued community, loyalty, and collective effort above all else. The animals, as mentioned, were not just sources of food and labor. They were integral members of the longhouse ecosystem, particularly during the brutal winter months. Their presence inside the longhouse was a practical solution to a dire problem: how to protect valuable livestock from freezing temperatures, deep snow, and predators. Cows, sheep, and goats, often tethered in separate stalls at one end of the longhouse, contributed their body heat, raising the ambient temperature by a few crucial degrees. Their manure, while adding to the longhouse's distinctive aroma, could also be collected and used as fertilizer for the fields in spring, closing a vital loop in the agricultural cycle. Chickens, if present, might also roost indoors, providing eggs and a small, but steady, source of protein. This close proximity to animals meant a constant awareness of their needs, their health, and their cycles. A sick animal could mean disaster for a family, a loss of food, wool, or milk that could not easily be replaced. The relationship between humans and their animals was one of mutual dependence, a testament to the intricate balance required for survival in such a challenging environment. To truly understand life in a Viking longhouse, one must attempt to immerse oneself in the full sensory experience. Beyond the smells of smoke and animals, beyond the perpetual chill and the dim light, there was a cacophony of sounds. The crackling and hissing of the central fire, a constant, comforting presence. The low murmurs of conversation, the rhythmic clack of the loom, the occasional bleating of a sheep or the lowing of a cow. The wind whistling through the turf walls, a mournful song from the outside world. The patter of rain or the crunch of snow on the roof. The scrape of a wooden spoon against an iron pot, the sharpening of a knife, the thud of an axe splitting firewood. At night, the sounds would shift, the deep breathing of many sleeping bodies, the rustling of straw, the occasional snore, perhaps the soft cries of a baby. It was a symphony of survival, a constant reminder of the lives being lived within those sturdy walls. The touch of the longhouse was equally visceral. The rough, unplaned timber, smoothed by generations of hands. The damp, cool earth floor, often covered with springy rushes that would need regular replacement. The scratchy feel of wool against the skin, offering warmth but rarely softness. The cold, hard stone of the hearth, radiating its precious heat. The dampness clinging to clothing, to hair, to skin, a persistent clamminess that never truly left. The feel of rough, calloused hands, hardened by labor, constantly at work. This was a tactile world where every surface, every material spoke of its purpose and its origin, a world stripped bare of modern comforts where the senses were constantly engaged in the struggle for existence. The psychology of living in such conditions is perhaps the most difficult aspect for us to grasp today. The sheer resilience required to face such constant hardship, day in and day out, year after year, is almost unimaginable. There was no escape, no easy way out. Life was a relentless cycle of work, survival, and preparation for the next brutal season. Yet within this crucible of hardship, human spirit not only endured but thrived. The strong bonds of community, forged in shared struggle, were paramount. The simple pleasures, a warm meal, a roaring fire, a compelling story, the laughter of children, would have been cherished with an intensity we might struggle to comprehend. There was a deep connection to the land, to the animals, to the cycles of nature, a profound understanding that their very existence was dependent on these forces. This constant engagement with the raw elements of life fostered a practical, stoic, and deeply communal worldview. It was a world that demanded strength, ingenuity, and an unyielding will to live. The longhouse, therefore, was more than just a dwelling. It was the beating heart of Viking society, the crucible in which their culture was forged. It shaped their families, their communities, their beliefs, and their very character. It was a testament to their ability to adapt, to innovate, and to endure in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. It was a place where life was lived on the edge, where every day was a victory against the odds, and where the line between survival and oblivion was often perilously thin. The legacy of the Longhouse is not just in its archaeological remains, but in the enduring spirit of resilience, community, and ingenuity that it fostered, a spirit that allowed the Vikings to not only survive but to explore, to trade, and to leave an indelible mark on history. And as we consider the sheer tenacity required to simply exist within those brutal, cold walls, we begin to understand the true depth of their endurance and the raw power of human adaptability. It was in these longhouses, under the thick layers of turf or timber, amidst the smoke and the cold, that the Viking spirit was truly forged, not merely in the raids or the longships that carved paths across the North Atlantic, but in the quiet, relentless struggle of everyday survival. The longhouse was a teacher, a crucible, and a mirror to the harshness of the natural world, shaping the values, resilience, and ingenuity of all who dwelled within. As night deepened in the longhouse, one could sense the subtle rhythms of life within the walls. The adults, weary from the day's labors, would settle into their sleeping platforms, often still shrouded in furs and blankets of coarse wool. Conversations would taper off to hushed tones, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire or the occasional snort of a cow or bleat of a sheep. The children, if not already asleep, might whisper among themselves, sharing secret games or mimicking the storytelling of their elders. The flickering shadows cast by the hearth would dance across faces, giving even the most familiar features a haunting, almost supernatural quality. In the silence punctuated by these small sounds, one could almost feel the pulse of the longhouse itself, the slow, steady heartbeat of a community intertwined, reliant on each other for survival, for warmth, for life. Sleep in the longhouse was a precarious affair. The cold crept in through cracks in the walls, seeping into the bones despite layers of furs and blankets. Snoring mingled with the moans of restless livestock. Dreams were colored by the day's labors and fears, the coming storms, the threat of predators, the possibility of illness or loss. But even in sleep, the longhouse nurtured vigilance. The close quarters meant that any sudden disturbance, an animal in distress, the wind battering against the roof, the sound of an intruder, would be immediately sensed, and the household would awaken in coordinated, efficient response. This constant preparedness was as much a psychological defense as a practical one, conditioning the Vikings from birth to be attuned to the rhythms of danger and survival. The Longhouse was also a repository of memory and history. Carvings in the wood, often subtle but meaningful, told stories of past events, victories, and losses. Weapons leaned against walls bore inscriptions or decorations that commemorated battles or honored ancestors. Ceremonial items, such as finely crafted drinking horns, runed stones, or small figurines of gods, served both practical and symbolic purposes, linking daily life to the rich tapestry of Norse mythology. Even the arrangement of objects within the space, where tools hung, how food was stored, the placement of furs, was a reflection of accumulated wisdom, an inheritance of knowledge passed down through generations. The Longhouse was not just a shelter, it was a living archive, a vessel of cultural memory in which every object, every corner, told a story of survival, ingenuity, and identity. Seasonal change defined life in ways that modern humans might find almost alien. The long, dark winters imposed both hardship and reflection, while the fleeting summers demanded tireless energy. As winter waned, the first signs of spring would be subtle at first, a softening of the wind, the gradual lengthening of the day, the faint smell of thawing earth. The inhabitants of the Longhouse would emerge more frequently, tending fields and gardens, inspecting livestock, repairing structures, and preparing for the intensely productive months ahead. The arrival of spring was both a relief and a challenge, as the Longhouse had to transition from a fortress against the cold to a functional hub of agricultural and social activity. The children would find new freedom to play in the open air, to explore forests and streams, to learn the natural rhythms of their environment firsthand. The elders, with eyes keenly attuned to the subtleties of nature, would guide preparations for the planting season, teaching younger generations the precise timing required to sow and nurture crops for the survival of the entire household. Summer was a time of fevered activity, almost a celebration of life itself after the oppressive dormancy of winter. Fishing expeditions became longer and more daring, traveling farther into fjords or along treacherous coastlines to secure the bounty that would sustain them for months. Men would work tirelessly, constructing and repairing longships, ensuring their seaworthiness for trading, raiding, or exploration. Women would gather herbs, process textiles, and prepare food not just for immediate consumption, but for preservation, anticipating the harsh months ahead. Children would shadow adults in various tasks, learning by hands-on experience the skills and knowledge that were the very fabric of Viking existence. Every sunrise heralded a cascade of work, a tangible reminder that survival was an ongoing, demanding endeavor, and that idleness was a luxury these people could not afford. The Longhouse also played a central role in the spiritual and ritualistic life of the Vikings. Daily routines were interlaced with offerings, prayers, and rituals intended to appease deities and ensure protection and prosperity. Hearths often bore small carvings or symbols of gods, and it was not uncommon for families to dedicate a portion of their meager resources to ceremonial purposes. Feasts and sacrifices marked significant milestones: the birth of a child, a successful hunt, the completion of a challenging voyage. Music, too, filled the Longhouse with lyres, flutes, and the human voice providing rhythm and harmony to both work and celebration. These ritualistic and artistic elements were not frivolous. They were essential for maintaining psychological resilience, reinforcing communal bonds, and creating a sense of order in a world otherwise dominated by unpredictability and hardship. Conflict and hierarchy were ever-present realities within Longhouse life. The spatial organization reflected the social order. The most prominent members of the household enjoyed proximity to the hearth and greater access to warmth, while dependents, thralls, and the youngest family members occupied more marginal positions. Disputes, though often subdued by the necessity of cooperation, were inevitable. Negotiation and mediation were constant, and the skills to resolve conflicts without destabilizing the household were highly valued. Even children were socialized into understanding these dynamics, learning the nuances of hierarchy, the consequences of disrespect, and the subtle strategies required to navigate complex interpersonal relations. The Longhouse, in this sense, was not merely a physical structure. It was an incubator for social learning, a place where cultural norms, ethics, and survival strategies were continually rehearsed and reinforced. Despite the ever-present harshness, the Longhouse was also a locus of profound intimacy and communal support. Births took place within these walls, often attended by experienced women who guided mothers through the trials of labor. Marriages, celebrations, and seasonal festivals transformed the Longhouse into a space of collective joy, music, and dance. These moments were fleeting but vital, providing psychological relief and reinforcing the bonds that were critical for enduring the prolonged and punishing winters. Even grief and mourning were communal affairs, with the Longhouse serving as a venue for ritual remembrance, storytelling, and collective consolation. The emotional life of its inhabitants was inseparable from the physical and social realities of the space. The Longhouse was at once a shelter from the elements and a sanctuary for the human heart. The architecture of the Longhouse, too, deserves deeper reflection. The deliberate design choices, the pitched roof to shed snow, the smoke hole to manage fire and ventilation, the strategic placement of sleeping platforms, reflect a sophisticated understanding of both environmental pressures and human needs. Builders employed not only practicality, but also subtle forms of aesthetic consideration. Carved beams, intricately patterned doorposts, and the careful alignment of structural elements showcased a blend of utility and artistry. These structures were labor-intensive to construct, demanding collective effort, knowledge of timber and turf properties, and a careful balance between insulation and ventilation. Yet once completed, the Longhouse was remarkably durable, capable of withstanding decades of storms, snow, and ice, a testament to the Vikings' ingenuity and resilience. Food culture within the Longhouse was dictated by both necessity and ingenuity. Preservation techniques such as smoking, salting, fermenting, and drying were not merely culinary experiments, but essential strategies for ensuring survival. Fish, salted or smoked, provided protein during lean months. Grains and root vegetables offered sustenance and variety. Fermented beverages, often low-alcohol ales or meads, were consumed daily, providing hydration, calories, and a mild antiseptic effect. Feasts, though infrequent, were carefully orchestrated affairs, demonstrating both wealth and resource management. Guests were welcomed with hospitality, reinforcing social bonds and alliances that extended beyond the immediate household. Food was thus both sustenance and social currency, central to the Longhouse's role as a hub of community life. The physical and mental toll of Longhouse living cannot be overstated. Chronic exposure to cold, dampness, and smoke challenged the body daily. Nutritional deficiencies, infections, and injuries posed constant threats, while psychological strain arose from confinement, monotony, and the relentless demands of labor. Yet the Longhouse also fostered remarkable resilience. Interdependence created strong social cohesion. Ritual and storytelling reinforced identity and purpose, and practical skills, honed over generations, enabled survival in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The experience of life within these walls shaped not only bodies and minds, but also the cultural identity of the Norse people, a people capable of both extraordinary brutality and remarkable ingenuity. Even in the broader context of Viking exploration and expansion, the Longhouse remained central. Every successful voyage, every raid or trade expedition originated from and returned to the Longhouse. It was the base of operations, the planning chamber, the storehouse of supplies, and the safe haven for those who risked the unpredictable seas. The Longhouse anchored their world, a tangible connection between domestic life, economic activity, and the wider geopolitical reality of the Norse. It was here that maps were drawn, strategies devised, and stories shared of distant lands, laying the groundwork for the Viking Age's enduring legacy of exploration, commerce, and conquest. To step into a Viking longhouse, then, is to step into a world that is both alien and familiar. Alien in its relentless exposure to natural forces, in its harsh sensory landscape, in the intensity of labor required to maintain life. Familiar in its echo of human needs, warmth, sustenance, community, ritual, learning, and the desire for continuity. It is a world where survival and social cohesion are inseparable, where the mundane is heroic, and where the ordinary acts of living, cooking, tending animals, repairing tools, take on epic significance. The Longhouse is a lens through which the full spectrum of Viking life can be understood, revealing not just how they endured, but why they thrived in an environment that would break lesser societies. The enduring fascination with Viking culture, often romanticized in modern media, owes much to the stark reality of life in the Longhouse. The myths of conquest, exploration, and martial prowess are inseparable from the everyday realities of survival in cold, smoke-filled spaces. The Longhouse was both stage and crucible, a microcosm in which the skills, values, and culture of the Vikings were honed and perpetuated. Understanding the sensory, social, and psychological dimensions of these spaces allows us to appreciate the Vikings not merely as raiders or explorers, but as human beings responding ingeniously to an unforgiving environment. As we imagine the Longhouse through the lens of history, archaeology, and imagination, the lessons are manifold. The interplay of environment, architecture, culture, and human resilience offers insights into how societies adapt to extreme conditions. The balance of communal living, hierarchical organization, ritual practice, and skill transmission demonstrates the complex social engineering inherent in even the seemingly simple structures of the past. And perhaps most profoundly, it reminds us that human ingenuity and adaptability are timeless qualities, capable of shaping lives and cultures even under the harshest conditions. Through the smoke, the cold, the darkness, and the incessant labor, the Vikings forged a culture of resilience, skill, and interdependence. The Longhouse, in all its simplicity and complexity, was the crucible for this culture. It was here that children learned to survive, that families bonded and endured, that stories and skills were passed from generation to generation. It was a place of work and play, of joy and grief, of ritual and pragmatism, a place where life in its most unvarnished form was lived in full, demanding everything from its inhabitants, yet offering the profound satisfaction of human achievement and survival in return. The legacy of the Viking Longhouse is thus far more than architectural. It is cultural, social, psychological, and symbolic. Archaeological remnants give us the physical outlines, but the true essence, its smells, sounds, textures, and rhythms, can only be approximated through historical reconstruction, imagination, and careful interpretation. By stepping mentally into the Longhouse, we can begin to understand the magnitude of human endurance, the ingenuity required to survive in extreme conditions, and the ways in which environment and culture shape one another in profound and lasting ways. As we conclude our exploration of life within the Viking Longhouse, it becomes clear that to study these structures is to study life itself, not the life of kings or warriors alone, but the life of ordinary people whose daily acts of survival, labor, and community sustained their culture and left an indelible imprint on history. In their smoke-filled, cold, and often perilous homes, the Vikings demonstrated the full spectrum of human adaptability, creating a society capable of both enduring hardship and reaching out to the wider world with skill, courage, and ambition. Through this intimate lens, we come to appreciate that the true power of the Vikings lay not solely in their raids or voyages, but in the quotidian resilience cultivated within these long, narrow spaces, where fire, community, and ingenuity converge to sustain life against the harshest elements. It is a testament to the unyielding human spirit and a reminder that even in the most challenging circumstances, communities can thrive, identities can be forged, and cultures can endure. Life in a Viking longhouse was brutal, cold, and relentless, but it was also the source of extraordinary human ingenuity, resilience, and social cohesion. It was a world in which every action had meaning, every labor contributed to survival, and every human connection was vital. From the rhythmic clack of the loom to the flickering shadows cast by the hearth, from the icy draft seeping through the walls to the shared laughter of a family in the dim glow of the fire, the longhouse embodied the full spectrum of human experience. And as we leave its imagined warmth and step back into our modern lives, we carry with us a profound respect for the ancestors who endured, adapted, and thrived in one of history's most unforgiving environments.